From the beginning of the war, the Mississippi Valley's powerful slaveholding, political, and economic interests feared the impact of a federal invasion on their mercantile trade and slave controls, and pressured the Confederate government to fortify strong points along the Mississippi River. However, a shortage of military engineers, repeated changes in the Western command structure, and conflicting departmental overlaps prevent implementation of any cohesive defensive strategy. Confederate engineers rely on traditional methods to defend navigable waterways by using a combination of shore batteries, channel obstructions, chain barriers, and whatever naval forces that can be assembled. Although effective in the past, such measures have not been tested against steam-propelled and iron-plated warships. In mid-August 1861, erection of earthworks began under the direction of Captain Andrew B. Gray and a crew of several hundred slave laborers, but the occupation of Columbus, Kentucky diverted men, material, and attention away from the project. Beset by shortages of labor and tools like shovels and wheelbarrows, fortifying the island continued only sporadically throughout the fall. Attempts to employ unarmed regiments in construction are resisted as Southern soldiers object to being assigned similar tasks alongside slaves. An additional problem is that many of the heavy guns in place are mounted on squat naval carriages, which require cutting deep embrasures that weaken parapet strength and increase the likelihood of being flooded. Captain Gray's complaints go unheeded, and only after General Albert Sidney Johnston's western defensive line collapses in mid-February of 1862 do Confederate headquarters energetically push for New Madrid and Island No. 10 to be fully prepared to meet a federal onslaught. Union Major General Henry Wager Halleck, commanding general of the Department of the Missouri, is the first to set federal troops in motion towards Island No. 10 by rerouting troops intended for Tennessee to Commerce, Missouri, and selecting West Point trained and politically well-connected Brigadier General John Pope to lead them. Pope had spent most of 1861 fighting guerrilla bands plaguing Missouri, but on February 18th, Halleck ordered him to take charge of the Army of the Mississippi and crack the rebel defensive lines at Island No. 10 in New Madrid. On February 21st, Pope joins his army numbering nearly 25,000 men at Commerce, Missouri, and organizes it into 5 small infantry divisions commanded by West Pointers Brigadier General Schuyler Hamilton, Brigadier General John McAley Palmer, Colonel Joseph B. Plummer, Colonel Gordon Granger, and Brigadier General David S. Stanley. A week later, on February 28th, Pope's force advances southward to secure Sykeston as the nearest railhead to supply operations against Island No. 10. This marks the start of the Battle of Island No. 10, or Battle of New Madrid. On March 1st, Pope's Federals encountered the first rebel resistance from the secessionist Missouri State Guard. The Army of the Mississippi arrives in front of New Madrid on March 3rd, but no immediate assault upon enemy works is planned, as the worst spring flooding in 3 years had raised the Mississippi River so high that rebel gunboats could fire over the levee on any attacking column crossing the flat terrain surrounding the town. Lacking heavy artillery, Pope keeps his main force out of range while locking the Confederate garrison inside their entrenchments under harassing fire. Union troops then await siege guns from Cairo, and for Union Navy Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote's ironclad Western Flotilla to arrive, before resuming active operations against Island No. 10. The evacuation of Columbus, Kentucky had hurriedly increased Confederate attempts to fortify Island No. 10, and the first Southern troops had arrived on February 24th, allowing Colonel Edward W. Gant, commander of the garrison at Fort Thompson in New Madrid, to assure General P.G.T. Beauregard that they would make a splendid defense. Brigadier General John Porter McCown soon assumes command of Confederate forces around New Madrid, having been one of the officers to have surveyed Island No. 10 the previous summer. And while some describe him as a fine martial figure, others think him an old dilapidated fellow with little energy. McCown's command is bolstered by Brigadier General Alexander P. Stewart and his brigade, along with Brigadier General James D. Barry Trudeau, and 10 companies of heavy artillerists, supplemented by the Southern Guards Battalion, detailed to serve the heavy guns. In trying to untangle the rapid influx of men and material arriving at the island, McCown discovers the carriages and iron traverse plates for some of the best cannon cannot be found. Lumber for gun platforms is lacking, and the limited ammunition supply on hand is being rapidly used up by practice firing. Battling inclement weather and soggy terrain, McCown races to emplace additional artillery. By March 13th, 19 guns are mounted on the island with another 22 on the Tennessee shore, and 10 days later, the number has risen to 52 cannon. Nonetheless, the rising Mississippi continues to imperil the Confederate position despite efforts at sandbagging or pumping. General McCown briefly harbors hopes of attacking Pope if the 3,000 Confederates defending New Madrid could be heavily reinforced from Major General Earl Van Dorn's Army of the West in Arkansas, but no troops are forthcoming. Some help does appear in the form of an improvised Confederate naval squadron commanded by 62-year-old Commodore George N. Hollins, one of the few U.S. Navy officers to join the Confederacy. Although lacking full crews, his Mississippi Flotilla consists of 7 converted river steamers: the CSS Livingston, General Polk, Maurepas, Pontchartrain, Calhoun, Grampus, Jackson, and the 2-masted screw-propelled brig CSS McRae. Another arrival is the floating battery CSS New Orleans, constructed out of the Pelican floating dock, now refashioned with a sloping casemate sheathed in boilerplate housing 16 guns and possessing the ability to raise and lower itself in the water by a system of valves. It is floated into position on the north side of the island to assist in closing off the main shipping channel. Although temporarily stymied by rebel artillery at New Madrid, Pope does not remain idle, and on March 5th, he dispatches Colonel Joseph B. Plummer to secure a lodgment on the Mississippi at Point Pleasant, nearly 10 miles to the south. The following day, Plummer's men seize the objective and overnight carve out hasty gun emplacements to harass rebel river traffic supplying Island No. 10. For several days thereafter, Commodore Hollins responds by furiously shelling Federal positions, but is repeatedly frustrated as Union gun crews merely withdraw under heavy fire and then return when rebel gunboats draw off. Plummer also places an additional unit, Battery M of the 1st Missouri Artillery, at Riddle's Point directly across the Mississippi from Temptonville, Tennessee, the only land route which the Confederates can use to extricate their forces at Island No. 10. On March 12th, Brigadier General Pope receives 1 8-inch howitzer and 3 24-pounder siege guns shipped from Cairo. In that same evening, the combined efforts of the 10th and 16th Illinois throw up pre-planned gun emplacements within 800 yards of rebel lines and have the guns ready to fire by dawn the next day. After a day of shelling, General McCown summons his commanders and gunboat captains for a war council aboard the CSS McRae. At the meeting, the Navy insists their vessels must withdraw downriver and that the infantry and stores must be loaded immediately, or nothing might be salvaged. In a decision that will later be heavily criticized, the officers conclude to remove the entire garrison that same evening. But poor execution and bad weather quickly wrecks an orderly withdrawal. At 11 p.m., a strong thunderstorm commences just as the retreat begins, resulting in troops becoming confused and sullen in the darkness. Several transport commanders refused to obey orders, and efforts to remove the heavy ordnance utterly fail. Near dawn, the last Confederate steamer tows the Hospital Wharf boat filled with sick men to the Tennessee shore, and the gunboats drop downriver below Temptonville. Confederate naval participation in the campaign now effectively ends, as Holland believes his entire squadron will face annihilation if forced to confront even a lone Union ironclad. On the morning of March 14th, General Pope marches his forces into New Madrid and telegraphs to St. Louis that, to my utter amazement, the enemy hurriedly evacuated the place last night, leaving everything. Besides occupying an important strategic position, Pope also counts spoils including 33 cannon, thousands of small arms and entrenching tools, as well as horses, mules, wagons, and plentiful ammunition. Union possession of New Madrid endangers Island Number 10, but Pope cannot cross the river without transports and gunboats to protect them. On March 15th, the Union Navy Western Flotilla and its ironclads under the command of Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote arrive, having recently wrapped up their involvement in the campaign with Ulysses S. Grant to capture Forts Henry and Donelson on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. It was the aftermath of this campaign that had delayed the Navy, as cracked iron plates needed to be replaced, and Flag Officer Foote had sworn he would never again go into a fight half prepared. Obtaining full crews is an additional problem, with men having to be recruited from among the Great Lakes watermen, further supplemented by 1,000 volunteers culled from the Union Army of the Potomac in the east. Foote is also keenly aware that fighting on the Mississippi would be different than it had been on other rivers. Engaging rebel land batteries on northward flowing streams permitted his vessels to stand on their wheels, exerting only enough motive power to keep in their battle positions with their heavily armored bows facing the enemy. If disabled, a vessel drifted with the current back to safety. But the Mississippi River flowed southward, and any gunboat knocked out of action would be swept into enemy hands. Experiments to test whether the ironclads can fight while backing upstream against the current fail, even when the twin anchors are placed astern to try and hold the ship in place. Finally, at 10 a.m. on March 14th, Foote's squadron, consisting of the ironclads USS Benton, Mound City, St. Louis, Louisville, Carondelet, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and the timber-clad USS Conestoga, cast off accompanied by ordnance boats, 14 mortar boats towed by steamers, and several transports loaded with troops, steamed down the river towards Island Number 10. The Union Navy flotilla arrives off Island Number 10 around 9 a.m. the next day, March 15th. However, prospects for immediate attack are not good, as the Mississippi's flood current is strong, and as Foote tells Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, Island Number 10 is harder to conquer than Columbus, and island shores are lined with forts, each fort commanding the other above it. Foote would avoid rash action and ignores suggestions that his western flotilla steam past rebel fortified points and wreak havoc all the way south to New Orleans, a move the Confederates secretly dread. Instead, Flag Officer Foote places his faith in the 11 mortar boats under the command of Army Captain Henry E. Maynader, who had been assigned to his squadron. These odd watercraft are flat-bottomed sculls 50 feet long and 25 feet of beam. Their sloping, boiler-plated bulwarks enclose a 17,000-pound Seacoast mortar that fires a 13-inch, 230-pound shell several miles in an arc propelled by 20 pounds of gunpowder. Although the 13-inch mortar crews have to huddle outside the bulwark and endure a stunning concussion each time the squat monster is fired, the sculls are also equipped with weather awnings that have some individual maneuverability by using sweeps. Hopes that these mighty weapons will blast the Confederates from their positions even emanates from the White House, as President Lincoln takes personal interest in that ensuring a large supply of mortar ammunition is ready to rain the rebels out of their entrenchments by treating them to a refreshing shower of sulfur and brimstone. On Sunday, March 16th, Foote's gunboats reconnoiter enemy positions while the mortars test proper range, resulting in desultory firing by both sides. In preparation for combat, the USS St. Louis and the USS Cincinnati are lashed on either side of the flagship Benton, so that if one vessel is disabled, the combined power of the others will prevent her from floating downstream. At 11 a.m. on March 17th, the USS Mountain City opens fire on rebel positions, and is soon joined by the rest of the Western Flotilla, except the Louisville, which had to return to Cairo to repair a boiler leak. Heavy fire is concentrated on Captain Edmund W. Rucker's battery on the Tennessee shoreline, and on the Belmont Battery located at the tip of Island No. 10. Confederate guns reply briskly, although outmatched in range, and the gunners of Rucker's battery have to use 20 men up to their knees in water to work the submerged block and tackle to wrestle each cannon back into position after every discharge. The Cincinnati is struck several times, and the Benton takes 4 direct hits, with one 8-inch solid shot smashing through the upper deck and passing the entire length of the vessel before finally falling spent upon the Commodore's writing desk. The only fatalities in the fleet, however, occur when one of the St. Louis rifled guns explode, killing 3 men and wounding a dozen more. By day's end, little serious damage has been done. Although naval observers witness their shells cutting up enemy earthworks, more water is let into some of the shore batteries. A 64-pounder is dismounted, and 2 Confederates have been killed, but nothing more. The engagement on March 17th ends at 7 p.m. as the gunboats return to their anchorages, while the mortar boats maintain a steady fire throughout the night. Flag Officer Foote is now content to let the mortars pound Island No. 10 into submission. As Union leaders begin to settle into a siege, the Confederates undergo a command change. McCown is promoted to Major General and sent to Fort Pillow, while Brigadier General William W. McCall is dispatched to replace him. McCall is a 45-year-old West Pointer from Maryland who had been twice brevetted for bravery in the U.S. Army, but had resigned and eventually joined the staff of General Albert Sidney Johnston as his Assistant Adjutant General. Hastily promoted to Brigadier General, he arrives at Island No. 10 on the morning of March 31st and learns that General Pope has an estimated 30,000 men, and is alleged to be digging a canal to circumvent the island, and that Union Navy gunboats cannot be challenged. McCown departs immediately, taking along several ranking officers, 5 infantry regiments, several field batteries, and all post records, making it difficult for McCall to accurately estimate his remaining forces. Reports show only 2,273 effectives on hand for the defense of the island, the Tennessee shore batteries, and to man the 50 guns along a 25-mile stretch of river. However, many men are sick with measles or mumps, and others lack proper arms, with officers reporting that many more men have broken down from the hard labor and exposure, as well as depressed by lack of mail and the pervading notion that Island No. 10 is untenable. On the island, provisions are in short supply. There are no bomb-proof shelters, and ammunition kegs have to be stored outdoors with only tarps to protect them. As for the Confederate River Squadron, McCall judges it worthless for offense or defense, and if Pope were to cross the river, the game is practically up. On April 3rd, the Confederate engineers report that the water batteries on the main shore and island will be able to beat back the enemy's boats back by daylight, but add that whether they will be able or not to prevent them from passing by during a dark and boisterous night, the future alone can disclose. Confederate fears are justified, for although Foote is willing to wait and let the mortars slowly do their work, not all his subordinates agree, and Pope repeats assurances that the gunboats might pass the island in the dark, as it is impossible to fire at night with any accuracy. The question of running past the rebel batteries is first raised at a conference of naval commanders on March 20th, but Foote dreads the thought of one of his gunboats falling into enemy hands. The havoc recently wrought by one rebel ironclad to the east in Hampton Roads, the CSS Virginia, adds to his caution, since it is known that 2 casemated enemy vessels, the CSS Arkansas and Tennessee, are under construction at Memphis. To counter these enemy threats, The War Department hastily approves the outfitting of 2 specially equipped rams to sink Holland's fleet if the gunboats are unable to do it. Pope also investigates using the Mississippi to his advantage, as springtime inundations have covered low-lying areas with as much as 10 feet of water. If a backwater channel can be found, then transports and even gunboats might safely bypass enemy guns. General Schuyler Hamilton initially suggests such a plan, and Pope seizes upon it as a way to both circumvent both rebel fortifications and Foote's intransigence. Colonel Josiah W. Bizzle and a 600-strong engineer regiment of the West are summoned, and needed equipment is requisitioned from Cairo. Bizzle's plan would connect the Mississippi to its tributary stream of Wilson's Bayou that debouches near New Madrid. The route would follow a flooded wagon road, then pass through a dense swampy wood for several miles before reaching the intended bayou. What is sometimes described as Pope's Canal is never really a canal at all, as the only digging is to widen the levee branch for easier access by work vessels and to permit a greater influx of river water. Although Confederate commanders are aware of Pope's activities, no efforts are made to hinder the operation, as no one believes it will succeed. While Colonel Bizzle works, the naval bombardment of Island No. 10 continues, with the mortar shells resembling shooting stars lighting up the night sky, as often watched by sailors while sitting on the deck reading newspapers or writing letters. An additional aerial component is added on March 25th when Captain John Steiner's balloon Eagle ascends 500 feet to survey enemy strength and gauge the effectiveness of the shell fire. But hazy weather prevents a clear picture from being attained. By the beginning of April 1st, it is apparent that the mortar shelling alone will not be able to destroy the enemy's defenses, provoking Army men to joke that the Navy's only contribution to the campaign is bombarding the state of Tennessee at long range. Foote finally bows to pressure and agrees to risk one of his Western Flotilla gunboats to break the stalemate. Commander Henry Walk of the USS Carondelet wins permission to test whether the enemy's batteries can be evaded, a maneuver that low-ranking sailors already believed would surely succeed. To improve Walk's chances, Colonel George Washington Roberts of the 42nd Illinois and 40 picked men launch a nighttime raid on Rutgers Battery on the Tennessee shore. Cloaked by a rainstorm, the Federals land, drive off 2 startled enemy pickets, and in a matter of minutes spike the guns and shove off to return to the fleet. Colonel Roberts' men are long out of sight by the time Confederate reinforcements wade through hip-deep water to reclaim the emplacement. The floating battery New Orleans is the next obstacle to be removed, and on the morning of April 3rd, the Benton, Cincinnati, and 3 mortar boats concentrate their fire on it, scoring several direct hits. Fearing destruction, its commander, Lieutenant Samuel W. Everett, cuts the mooring cables and the New Orleans drifts downstream to an effectual position 2 miles below the island. The following morning, the USS Carondelet is stripped for action. Planks from a wrecked barge cover the unprotected deck to resist plunging shots. Surplus chains are coiled over the vessel's most vulnerable parts. An 11-inch hawser is wound about the pilot house as far up as the viewing slits, and cordwood barriers are stacked about the boilers. Sailors are armed with pistols, hand grenades, and cutlasses. Hoses are attached to the boilers to scald enemy boarders, and 23 sharpshooters from the 42nd Illinois supplement the crew. Additionally, a coal-laden barge stacked high with baled hay is tied to the port side to shield the vulnerable magazine. Near 10 p.m., the moonless night of April 4th unexpectedly erupts with a violent thunderstorm as the Carondelet moves into the current. The gun ports are sealed, all orders are whispered, and the only light permitted is a lantern in the engine room. Shrouded in rain, Carondelet passes the Tennessee emplacements unchallenged. But when just opposite the island emplacements, the collected soot in one of the smokestacks, no longer dampened by steam exhaust vapor, burned out, sending flames shooting out the chimney. Confederate sentries opened fire, sending artillerists running through the downpour. However, the rebel gunners have great difficulty gauging the range between flashes of lightning, and each cannon rarely has a chance to fire more than 2 shots. Piloted by 20-year-old river veteran William R. Hull, the USS Carondelet in its ungainly coal barge grazes the shallows near the head of the island, but buoyed by the swift current and regains the main channel. On the deck, exposed to the storm and enemy fire, Charles Wilson and Theodore H. Gilmore are tasked to gauge the water depth using leaded weights and pass the information onto the pilot house. Once past the island, confrontation with the floating battery New Orleans proves anticlimactic as the Hulk fires only a few ineffective shots. Greeted by bonfires at New Madrid, the Carondelet suffers her only mishap of the morning by running aground 50 yards from berthing. Shifting astern, the crew in the forward guns allow the lightened bow to swing free, and the gunboat safely moors at 1 a.m. Having taken 2 hours in passage and 1 hour aground, rebel guns had fired some 47 shots, but only 2 solid projectiles managed to lodge into the coal barge. That same night, General Pope had received the additional cheering news that his transports had made it through Bissell's Channel and were waiting now concealed in Wilson's Bayou. As April 5th dawns, Army staff officers board the Carondelet to reconnoiter enemy fortifications 20 miles downriver, and on the return trip, the gunboats delay long enough to shell an enemy emplacement opposite Point Pleasant, and sends a squad ashore to spike the cannons after the defenders hastily withdraw. Pope immediately requests that a second ironclad be sent to him, and Foote grudgingly agrees. On the night of April 6, under the cover of another serendipitous thunderstorm, the Pittsburgh makes a successful dash past island number 10, arriving at New Madrid undamaged at 5 a.m. the next day. With vessels now able to safely move past the island, on April 7th, the gunboats moved to destroy the Confederate batteries at Watson's Landing, the place Pope had selected for the attack on island number 10. With General McCall's forces being surrounded by the Union on all sides, the Confederates raised the white flag over island number 10 on April 8th. The Union has just won a decisive victory on the Mississippi, and it is the first major step in reopening the mighty river to Union traffic. However, Pope's victory is overshadowed in the press by the Butcher's Bill to the southeast along the Tennessee River at Pittsburgh Landing, near a small church known as Shiloh.